The ICU's fluorescent glare had long since blurred into a constant white hum when my phone buzzed against the metal of the nurse's station, a small intrusive vibration that cut through the steady beeping of monitors and made my hands feel suddenly foreign to my body. 12 hours into the shift, my eyelids were gritty and my feet heavy, so I assumed it might be another admission or a scheduling alert, but when I unlocked the screen, the notification made my stomach drop. $7,250 in charges, 5 airline tickets to Santorini, charged to my own credit card, and the list of names that scrolled under the transaction felt like someone else's life being printed across my chest. Richard Vale, Lillian Vale, Spencer Vale, Reagan Vale, Megan Tanner, Reagan's college friend, none of them me. And for a moment I had to press my thumb harder into the glass to make sure the numbers didn't blur. I wanted to laugh, and then I wanted to sink, because only last week at my parents' gleaming cherrywood dining table, my mother had folded her linen napkin with those exact, hospital-precise corners and said, almost bored, "Tickets are $1,450 apiece. If you can't afford it, it's best you sit this one out." And I had nodded and swallowed and lied to myself about how thin my savings had grown after covering Spencer's car repair last month, and that sting, "if you can't afford it," had been small and private then, but seeing my card charged for their happiness felt like theft that landed in the middle of an exposed bruise. I fumbled for the bank number, called, locked the card, filed the dispute, and listened to a calm fraud representative tell me in a voice practiced to soothe that of course this was fraud and that they would take it from here. But the voice on the phone could not fix the way my hands trembled as I typed Spencer's name into the message thread. "Something's wrong with the tickets. Can you fix it?" His text read half an hour later, and the reflex to answer in service rose up, because that's who I have been. Available, reliable, the one who patches problems for the family, until another part of me, winded from caring too long, straightened and typed back, "Like you said, I stayed behind." And then I changed every password I had, my fingers moving with an almost clinical efficiency. Banking apps, email, Amazon where the card had been cached, my Apple ID, because small acts of protection felt like the only place I could put my power. And while Mr. Jenkins needed his pain medication on time and Mrs. Torres wanted the update on her husband's surgery, their needs were honest and immediate and did not come packaged with entitlement or the expectation of taking more than was given. Within an hour, my phone vibrated into a list of missed calls and voicemails: Mom, Dad, Spencer, Reagan, and furious, manipulative texts that alternated between accusation and guilt-tripping, and I slid the phone into my locker during my brief lunch break and let their voices pile up unheard, while a strange, settling calm replaced the adrenaline, like someone had lifted a heavy, damp quilt off my chest, and for the first time in years, a decision that had been gathering inside me solidified into a promise. Not tonight, not again, not like this. I deleted 17 missed calls, 9 voicemails, 32 messages without listening to a single one, and felt the pressure of obligation fall away with each tap. By the time my shift ended, the silence in my apartment felt cavernous and new, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of cars. And though at first the quiet made the emptiness of my place, no family voices, no shared dinner, feel lonelier than anything, it also felt like the absence of a leash. And for once I drove home without the familiar gnawing soundtrack of what I owed everyone else. Still, I could not pretend my mind was calm. I worked extra shifts to avoid thinking, screened calls, and lay awake at odd hours picturing how my parents would react when confronted with the truth. Then received Marcus's call from the fraud department 2 days later, and listened as the soft concern in his tone made my chest hollow. "Miss Vale, preliminary investigation shows that the authorized user account used to make these purchases belongs to Spencer Vale," he said, and the room tilted, a procedural word becoming a verdict. I remembered removing Spencer as an authorized user 2 years ago after he got married, the small, hard choice that felt for a long time like the final step in teaching him responsibility, and I could not reconcile that memory with Marcus's further report that the account had been reactivated online 4 months earlier using my own login credentials. This was not a momentary lapse or a one-off impulse. This was deliberate, months-long deceit. And as Marcus read out a pattern of smaller purchases, electronics, restaurants, sporting goods, my mind ran back through the ledger of favors and fixes I had been quietly compiling for years. The lease I co-signed for Spencer's first apartment, the emergency loan for Reagan's car, paying for Dad's last-minute plane ticket when a conference clashed with a family emergency. Small mercies and large that blurred into an accepted family economy where my role had been clear: stability, cover, bank. And the realization landed like a quiet fist in my ribcage that for over a decade, my generosity had not been met with gratitude, but with entitlement. I wanted to scream at the audacity, at the way my face might look at Dr. Stevens in the corridor now, tenured, practical, with the kind of quiet that conceals everything. And instead, I sat down hard and told Marcus I wanted to pursue this fully, because the numbers mattered, yes, but the record mattered more. Proof that what they'd been doing was not family spontaneity, but calculated taking. When I hung up, the string of missed calls started again, and my mother's voice came through on speaker, bright with practiced concern, and rather than feel mollified, I felt violated as she said, "We've been trying to reach you for days, honey." The chorus of their panic threaded like a rehearsed chorus around a claim I had somehow made myself complicit in, and I realized in stages, the bank's clear statement, the reactivation traced to my credentials, the quiet ledger of favors, that something in me had to change not only to recover money, but to keep my life from being a revolving door of other people's emergencies. After the bank confirmed what my gut had begun to suspect, the betrayal unfurled into a pattern that I could no longer smooth over with excuses. Marcus's emails arrived with dates and transaction descriptions and the terrible precision of confirmation. And as I sat cross-legged on my couch in the night, rain tapping a steady rhythm against the window, I watched the list of charges scroll by and felt my world condensate into a ledger. The Santorini tickets were the crest, but beneath them were months of smaller, steady drains. Appliance purchases, dinners, sporting equipment that, when added together, told a story not of an accident, but of a habitual siphoning. And the realization tasted like metal in my mouth because somewhere along the line, I had stopped being a child in my parents' house and become their safety net, the person who could be called at any hour to fix, bail out, or smooth over. And every time I had said yes to them, I had widened the gap between what I could keep and what I had given away. When I confronted Spencer with a calm I did not fully feel, he offered the kind of half-resentful apology that admits nothing. "I meant to ask you first, sis. Things just got hectic with planning." And Reagan, voice wavering on the other end, called me jealous, told me I was ruining everything for everyone when I took a boundary that had been buried for years. And for a period, I felt my sense of reality slip as threads of family narrative rewrote themselves to cast me as the unreasonable one, the daughter who made everything about me, when in truth I had been carrying everyone's emergencies as if they were my own. Worse, when my mother called Director Palmer and suggested I was under tremendous stress, the professional context I had worked hard to build suddenly became another arena for them to weaponize. And the office's polite inquiries about my workload felt like public tests of my composure. Yet while they deployed concern as a wedge, I began doing the opposite of what guilt had trained me to do. I collected evidence, because feelings are ephemeral, but records persist. And spending nights downloading 2 years of statements, writing dates beside transfers, and recording the soft, incriminating text threads that proved pattern and intent made something in me breathe easier. I kept a small, password-protected audio log in which I spoke the dates and little explanations so my memory would not be the only thing I had to rely on when their denials began. April 12th, Spencer claimed his account was frozen, borrowed $600 for rent and did not repay. May 29, Mom said I was obsessive for worrying about money. July 8th, Dad insisted he never knew Spencer was using my card even when he stood at the gate and watched the charges decline. And as I documented, I found an odd, quiet courage growing, a feeling like an intravenous line being clamped so I could get back some of what had been drained from me. Of course, they did not sit quietly while I organized my defense. Spirals went out into the orbit of family and friends, vague stories and sobbing videos circulated on social media, painting me as cruel and unreasonable, and someone, always someone, would call the hospital and plant the seed of doubt about my mental stability. Director Palmer, careful and clinical, asked if I was burned out, and I recited my hours, my overtime, my excellent evaluations. She nodded as if balancing my competence against possible fragility. And I wondered why the people who had repeatedly taken from me could, in the face of exposure, play the injured party so easily. Yet outside the family theatrics, there were human, uncalculated acts of kindness. A folded note tucked under a coffee cup at the nurse's station. Whatever you're going through, you're handling it with grace. Some family trees need pruning. Left by Dr. Stevens, a colleague who never asked for anything from me and who had seen me show up for patients at 3 a.m. without flair or fanfare, and that small, anonymous encouragement became armor. Simultaneously, a text arrived from Spencer's ex-wife, Elise, saying she had the same experience and that she had records. She had been too afraid to speak when they were married, she wrote, but she would send everything if I needed it. And her reaching out tightened the net of proof I was building, transforming what had felt like a private burden into a shared pattern of behavior. Aunt Martha, who had always managed the family trust, responded to my initial outreach with a restrained but decisive message. She had seen withdrawals that did not add up, and she was looking into Spencer's accounts. And for the first time in a long time, I felt less alone because someone who had the power to check the books was taking the step I had only begun to take for myself. As the week passed, more evidence arrived via private messages and unexpected allies. An uncle who had always been too polite to intervene texted that he had noticed things didn't add up. A cousin admitted she had always wondered where the money went. And an HR investigator from my father's old firm called with questions about expense reports bearing a troubling resemblance to patterns I had uncovered. Each new corroboration should have felt like revenge, but it felt more like a somber accounting, a slow, quiet dissection of habits that had been normalized, because I had been generous, and because others had learned to rely on that generosity like an automatic withdrawal. At hospital shifts between patient rounds and handoffs, I added a layer of pragmatic measures, freezing linked accounts, setting up new secure emails for financial matters, bringing my spreadsheet, every loan, every gift, every unpaid promise, into a format that would read professional if needed. And with each row I entered, I felt less like a passive ledger and more like someone reclaiming agency. Still, the emotional cost was relentless. My parents deployed guilt like a currency, my siblings cried in public and demanded reconciliation, and I was repeatedly forced to choose between maintaining a professional calm and addressing the personal treachery that had undermined my sense of who I was in my family's economy. But in the quiet hours, with rain on the window and bank emails in my inbox, I began to understand that the path forward would be less about extracting money and more about establishing the rules of engagement. No more co-signing, no more auto-pay for other people's lives, no more phone calls at dawn asking me to bail someone else out. And that for the first time, I could imagine a life where my love did not obligate me to be anyone's guarantor. When I finally decided to stop moving in circles of avoidance and build a confrontation that mirrored the careful way I managed medication charts and patient handoffs, I did it with the same precision I used to triage a patient in distress: a clear list, dated entries, and one tidy PDF invoice in which I summed 8 years of favors, loans, and unpaid temporary advances into a single unambiguous figure, $9,540, with a polite but immovable note attached. Repayment expected within 45 business days. Sending that document to Mom, Dad, Spencer, Reagan, and Aunt Martha felt like sliding a surgical report across a family table, clinical and exact in a way that left no room for the fog of "we meant well" or "it was a misunderstanding." And I remember the way my hands did not shake when I hit send, only a fierce and steady clarity, like a nurse who has rehearsed a code blue until her fingers know every motion. The family's response was immediate and predictably theatrical. Dad showed up at my apartment the next evening as if to negotiate, his face weathered and full of a practiced regret that smelled faintly of defense, and he presented Spencer's proposed half repayment with the brittle smile of someone who thinks compromise equates to restoration. I sat across from him, watching the way his hands fumbled over the keys he left on my counter, as if he still believed entitlement to be set down like accessories. And I found that my anger had become something else, not a scream, but a boundary with teeth, calm in a way that made their flailing look small. "We can smooth this over," Spencer said, earnestness manufactured, and Reagan's voice trembled between entitlement and shame. But when I opened my leather portfolio and laid out the statements, transfers, and dated notes, evidence of each instance when my generosity had been treated as a revolving credit line, I watched the air in the room change, thick with the weight of documents that bore witness to repeated choices. Spencer's jaw tightened, then collapsed, and when he finally admitted, voice cracking, that he had used my card without permission for months, the confession landed with the dull, solid thud of something unavoidable. And Reagan, who had for weeks posted tearful videos casting me as cruel, whispered that she had known, that they both had, and that the card's decline at the airport had been the result of a long accumulated threshold of taking. Dad's eyes did not meet mine. He nodded, something in him unspooling in a way I had almost stopped expecting. "We didn't," he began, but the sentence fell away and I finished for him. "You did." Because naming it made it a thing separate from my hurt and separate from my responsibilities. I had chosen, up to that night, to keep my life in their orbit because love had been braided with obligation in ways I had accepted as normal. But presenting the ledger and offering a calm, firm exit, no co-signatures, new apartment purchased with my independence in mind, refinancing the loans he had once guaranteed for me, shifted the stakes. I remember placing the set of keys I had carried for years on their polished entry table, not as a gesture of closure, but as a simple fact. I no longer wanted them to come in unannounced, to assume access to my home, my time, my money. There was a collective intake of breath as the house settled around the revelation, as the thin veneer of family normalcy cracked. Aunt Martha picked up the phone with a steadiness I had never seen and called the trust manager, asking questions that made the habits of withdrawals and unauthorized charges look like a pattern rather than an exception. Elise, Spencer's ex, had already forwarded bank statements that mapped withdrawals and repayments in a way that exposed deliberate planning, and Uncle David texted later that night saying that his own curiosity about where the money had gone suddenly made sense. A small but satisfying chorus of relatives whose private doubts had been validated. Still, victory did not look like fireworks. Instead, it felt like a weary, efficient clearing. Emails sent, bank disputes lodged, a meeting with Aunt Martha scheduled to review trust access, a quiet call to HR to let them know family members might contact them again, and a sense of grief for everything that had been allowed to happen under the name of help. When Dad finally left my apartment that night without a reconciliation, his shoulders had the look of someone who had been caught in his own arithmetic and had not yet learned the subtraction. And I slid the deadbolt behind him with a small, private sense of rightness that did not feel like triumph. After the confrontation, the social media storm they had tried to orchestrate, vague posts, tearful videos, accusations that I had doctored records to make Spencer look bad, crumbled because practical evidence is stubborn, and Aunt Martha's temporary freezing of Spencer's access to certain accounts bought me more time to disentangle the financial web they had spun. It was not easy. There were nights when I watched my phone buzz and felt a reflexive wish to answer, to explain, to beg for the old quiet of family dinners when I had not yet been a bank. But the ledger I carried became a kind of armor. Each line was its own small truth, every date and amount, a stitch in a new boundary I had finally sown. I also made space for unexpected kindnesses. Dr. Stevens brought a coffee and said quietly that he was glad I had set limits and that the hospital would support me if the family tried to interfere with my professional standing. Small, practical offers of help that felt honest in a way my family's theatrics never had. And when the dust began to settle, when Aunt Martha called to say she had been looking into discrepancies and might freeze certain trust privileges pending an audit, I felt something close to relief. Not the sweet buzz of vindication, so much as a steady, bright certainty that I could exist outside the pattern they had defined for me, that my generosity did not have to be an instrument for someone else's comfort at my expense. The weeks after the confrontation were not cinematic reconciliations, but rather a sequence of quiet, decisive unspooling. Dad called less and with less certainty in his voice. Spencer's bank initiated an internal review after Elisa's forwarded statements landed on the right desk, and Aunt Martha, who had quietly held the family accounting keys for years, began to act with an authority I had only ever seen brighten her voice at holiday tables, freezing certain access pending a fuller review. And while news trickled back via sympathetic relatives and the occasional private message that we should have noticed sooner, I found myself assembling a different kind of life in a new apartment whose walls I painted teal and sunlit yellow because color felt like reclaiming oxygen. The certified envelope that arrived a month later contained a check for $9,540, the precise amount of the invoice I had sent, and I remember setting it on my kitchen counter and feeling an odd, delicate relief that was not joy alone, but a complex mixture of closure and a small, pragmatic satisfaction that the ledger was balanced. I cashed the check, but rather than letting the money be a symbol of a moral victory, I turned it into something that stitched the experience back into service. I wrote a check to my hospital's foundation to establish a small scholarship for nursing students who were also primary caregivers or financial supports in their families. An act that felt like transforming a wound into a resource so that someone else might not need to erode their own savings to be responsible. My new apartment became a place where I could set rules without apology. No family keys, no unannounced visits, no joint finances, and a voicemail that would screen calls before I ever had to explain myself. I leaned into the routines that had always steadied me. Early morning waterings of potted plants on the east-facing balcony, long runs that let the city's morning light drain whatever tension lingered, painting landscapes until my hands remembered a different kind of labor. And when Jonah, the anesthesiologist, whose quiet directness felt like an antidote to endless emotional triangulation, asked about my family, I felt able to say without shame that we were taking space, that they had crossed boundaries I needed to keep. And he nodded, not because he had all the answers, but because he recognized the dignity in choosing peace over performance. Socially, the fallout was messy and imperfect. Reagan posted a performative apology that read more like a public relations draft than an admission. Some relatives stayed silent, and yet others, like Cousin Caroline and Uncle Robert, reached out privately with genuine remorse and offers of support. I replied with a brief, guarded honesty. I appreciate you reaching out. I'm rebuilding my life and boundaries. I don't need apologies, I need accountability. And accountability in slow, administrative ways arrived. Spencer faced investigations at his bank. Dad's consulting privileges at his old firm were curtailed pending an audit of expense reports. And several extended family members, faced with documents that had once seemed like petty grievances, admitted privately they had wondered about how the family finances flowed. At work, I found new sorts of support. Dr. Stevens and a handful of colleagues rallied when the family tried to contact the hospital. HR accepted my request to route any family inquiries through me in writing only. And the culture of care I loved about nursing became, ironically, a place where I could both give and be protected. 3 months in, the light in my apartment felt different. Literal sun through uncovered windows. A watercolor I had painted hung on the wall where morning light made the blues sing. And on a shelf, I placed a small shadow box containing the cashed check and the old house keys, not as trophies, but as a quiet memorial to what I had learned about belonging and boundaries. how being family does not grant indefinite permission to take. Life kept moving. Weekend hikes to the Blue Ridge, a small group of friends over for dinner, the scholarship application forms I drafted at the kitchen table. And I found myself saying no more often with less apology, which felt like saying yes to my own life. When my mother texted an invitation to a family gathering weeks later, I answered simply, "Thank you for thinking of me. I have other plans that weekend." No excuses, no explanations, and felt no tremor in my stomach when I hit send. The small celebrations that followed were the ones I had chosen. Elise and Aunt Martha came over for sparkling cider and brought a framed calligraphy that read, "You are not responsible for other people's comfort at the cost of your peace." And we toasted to boundaries that protect rather than punish. In the quiet after, I drove to the hospital foundation office and handed over the check to fund the scholarship, my small, formal act of converting pain into purpose, and felt a kind of peace I had not understood I could claim, a steady, daily thing that did not require apology or explanation, just the work of showing up and meaning it. There are moments, occasionally, when loneliness edges in, or when a text from Dad with a short, "I'm sorry," makes me pause and imagine a different ending. But then I look at the watercolor on my wall or at the plants thriving on my balcony and remember the way my life felt when every favor I gave carved away at me like a slow tide. And I choose the new life I have built, one in which love does not cost my financial security, where forgiveness is an option, not a price, and where sometimes the clearest way to keep caring without being consumed is to pick a direction and walk steadfastly in it.